Now, in Facts and Fascism, George Seldes quotes from another book, also nonfiction, specifically the German language edition, the 1935 German language edition of Mein Kampf, Adolf Hitler's autobiography. And here Der Fuhrer is talking about lying and the art of lying. And in the 1935 German language edition of Mein Kampf, Hitler wrote as follows, quoted by Seldes: "The size of the lie is a definite factor in causing it to be believed, because the vast masses of a nation are in the depths of their hearts more easily deceived than they are consciously and intentionally bad. The primitive simplicity of their minds renders them more easy victims of a big lie than a small one, because they themselves often tell little lies, but would be ashamed to tell big ones. Such a form of lying would never enter their heads. They would never credit others with the possibility of such great impudence as the complete reversal of facts. Even explanations would long leave them in doubt and hesitation, and any trifling reason would dispose them to accept a thing as true. Something, therefore, always remains and sticks from the most impudent lies, a fact which all bodies and individuals concerned in the art of lying in this world know only too well, and therefore they stop at nothing to achieve this end." Well, you'll recall that at the end of part 1 of this series, looking back from 1984, the hidden history of the Cold War, we wound up by discussing the fact that really World War II, at least on the Eastern Front, did not really end. The shooting war did not end in 1945. Now, as the Nazis retreated on the Eastern Front, they set up guerrilla groups to harass the Red Army in its rear. Now, these guerrilla groups combined not only with reactionary and nationalist elements in the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, the Ukraine and Poland, but also with German troops that had been cut off by the rapid advances of the Red Army during the closing stages of World War II. Now, these guerrilla groups waged a fierce, and we mean very fierce, warfare for almost 7 years. As late as 1952, some of these groups were still active after the formal close of World War II with VE Day in 1945. Now, many of these guerrilla groups were set up by a man named Reinhard Gehlen, last name Gehlen. Now, Gehlen was Adolf Hitler's intelligence chief for the Eastern Front, and his Eastern Front intelligence organization was called Fremde Heere Ost, or Foreign Armies East, and that was Adolf Hitler's intelligence organization, complete and intact. He set up many of these guerrilla groups, notably the Werewolf guerrilla group, and after World War II, Reinhard Gehlen and his entire Eastern Front intelligence organization, Hitler's entire Eastern Front intelligence organization, jumped, complete and intact, to the fledgling CIA. In fact, they were working for U.S. military intelligence even before the CIA came into being, and then when the CIA did come into being in 1947, the Gehlen organization, remember, Hitler's intact intelligence organization from the Eastern Front, became the CIA's Department of Russian and Eastern European Affairs. They incorporated more than 4,000 SS and Gestapo men, including virtually all of the Sicherheitsdienst, the SD, the SS intelligence service, and they became the sole purveyor of intelligence for the United States for more than a decade after the war. They also became, in turn, the official NATO intelligence organization, and then the BND, the Bundesnachrichtendienst, the West German intelligence service, which they are to this day. Now, a very important point to keep in mind, and this is where we wound up with last time, was the fact that as Reinhard Gehlen jumped to the CIA, he maintained radio contact with these guerrilla groups that, remember, began as a Third Reich operation and was shipping them weapons and liaison officers in partnership with the CIA. Well, it first was shipping them weapons and liaison officers in his function for the Third Reich, and then, while working with the CIA, continued to assist the Eastern Front guerrillas, the Axis guerrillas, who in essence simply switched uniforms. So we have a continuation of guerrilla warfare, a continuation of policy, if you will, complete from the Third Reich to the CIA. And These guerrilla groups, well, they really waged a very fierce warfare. We don't know exactly what the casualties were. Two details we mentioned last time were the fact that a Polish military writer referred to a gross casualty figure, perhaps just for Poland, of 12,556 killed. And then we looked at a section of a memorandum from a CIA official named Frank Wisner, W-I-S-N-E-R, and he referred to a Ukrainian fascist organization which incorporated many SS and Gestapo men as having killed 35,000 Soviet security personnel from 1945 to 1947 alone. And while that may have been a slight exaggeration because he was hoping to obtain sponsorship for this group by the CIA through another organ of the national security establishment called the Office of Policy Coordination, it's worth keeping that figure in mind because, again, the shooting did not stop in the Eastern Front in 1945. And it's worth noting, as we read in a passage from a book called The Belarus Secret by a man named John Loftus that we're going to be going back to here in a few minutes, that many of these groups became incorporated with the Special Forces, and that's where we're going to pick up right now.
All right, indeed. One other thing two quick things that should be pointed out. First of all, to put this back in historical perspective again, which sometimes is difficult when we're talking about this rather complicated and complex information, bear in mind now that while this does not obviously explain the entirety of the Soviet maintenance of presence in Eastern Europe, when you realize the fact that several, maybe tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers were killed by essentially Nazi commandos being supported by the Central Intelligence Agency after the close of World War II, it puts what might be called a different complexion on the issue of Eastern Europe. One other thing, although this doesn't come into place in this article, but as I was reviewing some of the information yesterday, it came to my mind. Those of you who are of faint of heart, some of the information we will be dealing with tonight, even though it's only written and hence spoken information, is rather graphic in terms of violence and things of that nature. So just warning you, if you're squeamish, I don't really know if I can let you know in advance, but some of it is rather unpleasant. We're talking about some rather unpleasant people.
Also worth keeping in mind an analogy that we made last time between the undeclared warfare which was being waged by the CIA against the Soviet Union after World War II is analogous in many ways to the undeclared war currently being waged against Nicaragua by that very same organization, and also using the much despised Somocistas, which comprise a very important element of the so-called Contras, the guerrillas, the CIA-financed guerrillas in Nicaragua. And of course, with the 20 million dead that the Soviet Union suffered in World War II, the use of SS and Gestapo men against that organization was very literally salt in the wounds, and certainly aroused much the same kind of fierce outrage on the part of Soviet citizens that the Contras do today.
Indeed, we're talking about a small group of people, as is quite a bit the case we've seen in several other cases in Vietnam and in Central America and South America, where a small group of people in the intelligence and military establishment, without the recourse of voters, without congressional or Senate involvement whatsoever in this so-called democracy, and I don't mean to be sarcastic, but in this situation one has to be a little bit, are in fact conducting foreign policy, a shooting war foreign policy. So bear that in mind. Okay, this first section is from a book by E.H. Cookridge called Galen, Spy of the Century. It was published by Random House in 1971. This little subheading is entitled Wisner Sets Up CIA's Private Army. Dulles, who is Alan Dulles, had made it clear to Galen that top priority must be given to the selection and training of agents for work in Russia. Wisner had already discussed this with Galen the year before, and also a plan to recruit men from amongst Eastern Europeans for hush-hush armed units to assist insurgents inside communist countries. The plan was not put into practice until 1952, when, after his election, President Eisenhower eased out General Beadle Smith from the CIA and made Alan Dulles its director. His brother, John Foster Dulles, had become Secretary of State just before and was embarking on his policy of brinksmanship. The Dulles brothers believed deeply that Stalin's captive nations would rise against communist oppression, given a modicum of encouragement. A private mercenary force was to be established in Germany to be ready for such an emergency and to be employed without involving regular U.S. forces. who else than Galen was the man to help in laying the foundations for such special forces. He and his former FHO and WALLI men, and also the SS officers who had served in the Brandenburg sabotage units and the Jagd commandos against the Red Army and Soviet partisans, had all the experience that was needed. There was no problem of finding enough volunteers among the many hundreds of thousands of displaced persons who still lived in misery in crowded camps. Skipping down. Many were unemployable, but the younger ones found lowly and poorly paid jobs on the land or as industrial laborers, clearing bomb rubble and working on the rebuilding of German cities. They provided a vast reservoir of potential recruits for the American-sponsored units, in which living conditions would be paradise compared with the utter misery of their present existence. The Ukrainians, Belarusians, Poles, Latvians, Estonians, Lithuanians, and the motley crowd of Russo-Asian nationals who represented the remnants of Vlasov's 600,000-strong Army of Liberation attracted Wisner's and Galen's attention.
The Vlasov Army, by the way, was an organization headed by a captured Red Army general named Andrei Vlasov, which fought for the Third Reich during World War II.
In the space of 2 years, about 5,000 were enlisted by Wisner and Galen, assembled in camps at Bad Wiessee, at Kaufbeuren in Bavaria, and at the U.S. Army Hammond Barracks near Mannheim, and trained by American officers and former German Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS NCOs. At Kaufbeuren, the commandant and chief instructor was Major Ronald Otto Bohlenbach, former U.S. Assistant Military Attaché in Moscow. These units became the nucleus of CIA's private army, later better known as the Green Berets in Vietnam. Some of them are today still stationed in West Germany. The 5th Special Reconnaissance Group, now entirely airborne, at Oberursel, and the 10th Special Group in Bavaria.
Now, Frank Wisner entrusted the formation of the 1st General Staff, so to speak, for the Special Forces, again, the Green Berets as we came to know them in Vietnam, to the aforementioned Reinhard Galen. Now remember, Galen was Hitler's intelligence chief for the Eastern Front and then jumped to CIA. Now, in forming the Special Forces, Reinhard Galen turned to 3 Nazi war criminals who had worked for the Third Reich, and they then functioned for Galen in putting together the Special Forces. Once again, reading from Galen's Spy of the Century by E.H. Cookridge, hardcover edition, Random House, 1971. Galen alerted several of his assistants who had a thorough knowledge